My sister stole my husband, so I built an empire and left them in ruins. Growing up, I always knew I was playing a game I had already lost before I even got a chance to compete. My name is Emily, though everyone calls me Em, and I was born the second daughter in what appeared to be a perfectly normal middle-class family from the outside. My sister, Charlotte, 4 years older than me, had always been the golden child, the one whose very existence seemed to be a source of endless pride for our parents. She had the kind of beauty that people noticed immediately: flawless blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that made strangers in grocery stores stop and compliment her. Meanwhile, I had dark brown hair that never quite settled the way I wanted, hazel eyes that never stood out, and a face my aunt once called interesting, though I knew it was her polite way of saying that I lacked whatever made Charlotte so effortlessly magnetic. In our household, being interesting wasn't enough to be worthy of admiration. In fact, it barely made me visible. The favoritism in my family was never subtle, never hidden, and never denied, even when I was too young to fully understand why Charlotte was the one who deserved more. Whenever she needed a new wardrobe for school, our mother would dedicate entire weekends to taking her shopping, helping her pick out the perfect outfits, and making sure she had everything she could possibly want. When I needed something as basic as a new pair of shoes, because mine were falling apart, I was told to wait until next month, but somehow, next month never seemed to arrive. My sister got the largest bedroom in the house, because, according to our parents, she needed the extra space for her studies, even though I was the one who actually enjoyed reading and studying late into the night. When Charlotte turned 16, there was a brand new car parked in the driveway with a giant red bow on top, a surprise gift from our parents that she had done nothing in particular to earn. When my 16th birthday rolled around, I didn't expect a car, but I also didn't expect to be handed a watch one that wasn't even particularly nice. Just a basic model that our mother had picked out last minute. She didn't even bother to wrap it. The real moment that solidified how little I mattered in comparison to my sister came years later when she graduated from high school, and our parents threw her the kind of celebration that seemed excessive, even for them. There was a catered dinner, dozens of family members and friends invited, and even a small fireworks display in the backyard because our father wanted to make sure everyone knew just how proud he was of Charlotte's accomplishments. At the height of the party, after plenty of wine had been poured and compliments had been thrown in her direction, he stood up to make an announcement. With an arm slung proudly around Charlotte's shoulders, he declared that they would be covering the full cost of her college education, so she wouldn't have to worry about student loans or working a job while studying. She was planning to major in business administration with dreams of becoming a financial consultant something our father could not have been prouder of since he worked in corporate finance himself. The entire room clapped. Charlotte beamed with excitement, and I stood in the corner, wondering what it must feel like to be so endlessly adored. 3 years later, when it was my turn to graduate, I achieved something even Charlotte never had. I finished high school with a near-perfect GPA, something I had worked for relentlessly not just to prove I was capable, but because I had convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to make my parents see me the way they saw her. The day I received my acceptance letters from multiple prestigious universities, I spread them out on the kitchen table, my heart pounding with nervous excitement as I waited for their reaction. Instead of pride, instead of excitement, I was met with uneasy glances exchanged between them, a hesitation in my mother's voice as she finally spoke. She told me, with a forced softness that barely hid the condescension beneath, that they simply didn't have the money to send me to college, not after all the expenses they had already covered for Charlotte's tuition. My father, always quick to back up whatever decision favored my sister, suggested that I take a year or two to work and save up, maybe even consider student loans if I was really determined to go. I sat there staring at them, barely able to process what I was hearing, especially considering the fact that just a week earlier, they had bought Charlotte a brand new laptop because her old one was too slow for her needs. That night, I cried harder than I ever had before, but it was the last time I would waste my tears on them. The next morning, I woke up with a decision already made in my mind. I would find a job, any job, and I would take control of my own life without waiting for them to suddenly decide I was worth investing in. Within a few weeks, I managed to secure a position as a maid at one of the most prestigious hotels in the city, the kind of place where only the wealthiest, most powerful people came to stay. My sister, upon hearing about my job, laughed and made some offhand comment about how at least I would learn how to keep a house clean for my future husband. I didn't dignify her with a response. Instead, I focused entirely on the work, determined to be so good at it that no one would ever be able to look down on me again. Unlike the other maids, many of whom only saw the job as a temporary means to an end, I treated it as my personal training ground. I memorized every detail about the way luxury hospitality functioned, taking note of how guests reacted to certain treatments, how the hotel handled complaints, and what separated a standard five-star experience from an unforgettable one. My diligence did not go unnoticed, especially by Margaret, the head housekeeper, who took me under her wing and taught me everything she knew. Within 6 months, I had been promoted to supervising the cleaning staff, an achievement that should have been small, but felt monumental considering where I had started. It was around this time that I first encountered James, a guest who checked into one of the hotel's most expensive suites and carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who was used to having people at his beck and call. He had the kind of presence that commanded attention without needing to raise his voice, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled, his tailored suits always impeccable. I first noticed him watching me one morning while I was overseeing the cleaning of the top floor suites, his gaze sharp but unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, measured, and entirely too confident. He asked if he could have a word with me, and what I assumed would be a simple request for an extra towel somehow turned into a 15-minute conversation about hotel operations. The next day, he happened to cross paths with me again, and then the day after that, and then the next, until it became clear that his interest in me was more than just casual. It wasn't long before he made an offer, a dinner invitation at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. I straightened my uniform, met his gaze directly, and declined, making it clear that if he was looking for some kind of temporary arrangement during his stay, he had chosen the wrong person. Instead of being offended, he simply laughed a sound that was more amused than condescending and assured me that his invitation came with no expectations. But I turned him down anyway, assuming that would be the end of it. I had no idea that meeting him would change the course of my life in ways I could never have imagined. The morning James checked out of the hotel, I assumed that whatever strange curiosity he had about me would disappear along with him. He left nothing behind except a business card, which he handed to me at the front desk with a knowing look, as if he already expected me to use it. I took it out of politeness, tucked it into my pocket without a second glance, and figured that was the last time I would ever hear his name. At the time, I had more pressing things to worry about than some wealthy man who found me interesting for reasons I couldn't quite understand. I had been promoted to front desk supervisor, a position I had worked tirelessly to earn, and with that came new responsibilities that occupied my every waking moment. I was constantly moving, constantly learning, constantly proving to myself that I deserved every bit of progress I had clawed my way toward. It wasn't until a few weeks after James left that I started to notice just how quickly things were shifting in my favor. The first sign came in the form of an unexpected meeting with the hotel's general manager, a man who had barely acknowledged my existence before. He called me into his office without warning, gestured for me to sit, and slid a folder across the desk with a polite but unreadable expression. Inside was a formal offer for another promotion, this time to head of the registration team, a position that placed me just below the assistant manager of the entire front office. I tried to keep my expression neutral as I read through the details, but my heart pounded so loudly that I could barely focus on the words in front of me. Promotions like this did not happen overnight, especially not to someone like me, who had neither a college degree nor any connections to pull strings behind the scenes. I wanted to ask why they were offering me the position so suddenly, but I knew better than to question good fortune when it landed in my lap. For a while, I allowed myself to believe that my relentless work ethic had finally paid off, that the hotel was simply recognizing my value after years of proving myself. It wasn't until I overheard two of the receptionists whispering about me in the break room that the first seeds of doubt crept into my mind. One of them, a woman named Rachel who had been working at the hotel longer than I had, was practically hissing in frustration as she spoke to another employee. She said it made no sense how I had moved up so quickly, how I had bypassed people who had been waiting years for the same opportunities. She insinuated, without a hint of subtlety, that I must have been sleeping with someone in power to have secured such rapid advancement. I could feel my hands shaking as I listened from behind the corner, my fingers curling into fists at my sides, every muscle in my body tensing with anger. I had sacrificed so much, worked so hard, and done everything the right way, only for people to assume that my success had been handed to me in exchange for favors I had never given. I wanted to storm into the break room, to demand that they say it to my face, to force them to admit that their resentment had nothing to do with my qualifications and everything to do with their inability to accept that I had outworked them. But instead, I took a deep breath, straightened my uniform, and walked away before I could let their words settle into my bones. The promotions did not stop there. Within 2 months of James's departure, I found myself sitting in another meeting, this time with the hotel's owner himself, a man I had only seen from a distance, but had never once spoken to directly. Henry was in his 60s, a sharp-eyed businessman with the kind of presence that made everyone around him stand a little straighter. He gestured for me to take a seat in front of his massive mahogany desk, sifting through a stack of papers before finally looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He told me I had done exceptional work since joining the hotel, that my rapid rise through the ranks had not gone unnoticed, and that he wanted to offer me the position of front office manager. I barely had time to process the words before he continued, his tone shifting slightly as if he were about to deliver news I might not like. He mentioned that the position typically required a degree in hospitality management or a related field, that under normal circumstances, someone without a formal education would not even be considered for it. My stomach twisted as I braced myself for the inevitable disappointment, for the moment where he would retract the offer and tell me that I had reached the end of the road. But instead, he smiled slightly, reached into his desk drawer, and pulled out a business card that he slid across the table toward me. I already knew what I would see before I even looked down. The name on the card was one I had seen before, one I had tucked away weeks ago without a second thought. James. Henry leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction carefully, as if he were trying to gauge how much I already understood. He explained that while he rarely took outside recommendations when it came to personnel decisions, James had insisted that he pay close attention to my potential. My head spun as I tried to process what he was saying, every puzzle piece falling into place all at once, forming a picture I wasn't sure how to feel about. For the first time since the promotions began, I finally had an answer to the question I hadn't even realized I had been asking. James had been watching. James had noticed me. And, more importantly, James had pulled strings behind the scenes to ensure that I had every opportunity to succeed. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the business card in my hands for what felt like hours, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. I wondered if I had been naive to believe that my success had been purely my own, if I had unknowingly been playing a game where the pieces had been arranged in my favor from the start. The thought made my stomach churn, made me feel like maybe, just maybe, the whispers behind my back had some truth to them after all. When I finally picked up my phone and dialed the number, My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the device before the call even connected. James answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and steady as if he had been expecting this moment all along. He said he had been wondering when I would finally reach out, the amusement in his tone making it clear that he had never once doubted that I would. I barely knew what to say, barely knew where to begin, so I settled on the only question that truly mattered. I asked him if all these promotions had been orchestrated by him, if my success had been built on favors I had never asked for. His response was firm, unwavering, and left no room for doubt. He told me that he had not given me anything I had not already earned on my own merit. He had simply ensured that the right people were paying attention. We spoke for hours that night, the conversation stretching on until the sun began to rise, as he told me exactly what had drawn him to me in the first place. He had seen something in me, something he recognized from his own past, the drive to prove myself against all odds, the relentless need to be more than what people expected. He had watched me from a distance, seen how I carried myself, and decided that I was worth investing in. 2 days later, when he invited me to dinner again, I no longer had a reason to say no. Sitting across from James at the dimly lit restaurant, I found myself studying him in a way I hadn't before, trying to piece together what kind of man would go out of his way to ensure the success of someone who, by all accounts, should have been insignificant to him. He had power, the kind that didn't need to be flaunted because it was simply understood, the kind that made people lean in when he spoke and second-guess themselves when he fell silent. I could see why people assumed a man like him never did anything without expecting something in return, but as the evening stretched on, I realized I couldn't find a single moment where he pushed for more than conversation. He never made any suggestive remarks, never let his gaze linger too long, never tried to make me feel indebted to him in a way that would imply I owed him anything beyond my gratitude. It unsettled me more than if he had tried to proposition me outright, because at least then I would know what he wanted. I expected him to steer the conversation toward business, to use the dinner as an opportunity to discuss my career, but instead he asked questions that had nothing to do with work at all. He wanted to know where I had grown up, what I had wanted to be as a child, what kind of books I liked to read when I had the time. At one point, he made an offhand remark about how he had looked into my employment history and noticed that I had never stayed in one place for too long before working at the hotel. When I hesitated, debating whether or not to explain why, he simply nodded as if he already knew the answer and changed the subject without pressing further. The realization that he had taken the time to learn about me on his own, without me ever having to offer up my past as proof of my worth, left me feeling strangely exposed in a way I wasn't sure I liked. The weeks that followed blurred into something I hadn't planned for, something that felt less like a calculated move and more like a slow unraveling of the walls I had spent years building around myself. I told myself that James and I were simply forming a professional relationship, that he was nothing more than a mentor who had taken an interest in someone he saw potential in. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the way my own feelings were shifting, the way I found myself looking forward to our conversations, the way my chest tightened whenever he was near. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was projecting emotions onto a situation that didn't call for them. But the moment he reached for my hand one evening after dinner, lacing his fingers through mine with a quiet certainty, I stopped trying to fight it. By the time a year had passed, I had finished my degree in hospitality management, moved out of my tiny apartment and into the penthouse James called home. I barely recognized the girl I had once been, the one who had scrubbed floors and folded sheets, the one who had walked home after long shifts with aching feet and an empty fridge. I attended charity galas and business meetings alongside James, dressed in designer clothes I never would have dared to touch before, sipping champagne while listening to conversations about investments and acquisitions as if I had always belonged in those circles. I knew people whispered about me, about the way I had seemingly appeared out of nowhere and positioned myself at the side of a man as powerful as James. I could hear it in the way some of the women spoke to me, their smiles just a little too tight, their compliments laced with thinly veiled condescension. It wasn't until one particular event, a high-profile gathering hosted by one of James's closest business associates, that I realized just how much my life had changed in the eyes of those who had once overlooked me entirely. I was standing near the bar, half listening to a conversation about real estate development, when I heard a familiar voice behind me, one that sent an immediate chill down my spine. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears, and found myself face to face with Charlotte, dressed in a sleek cocktail dress, her expression a mix of shock and something else I couldn't quite place. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything unspoken between us, stretching into something thick and suffocating. I could see the exact moment she pieced everything together, the moment her gaze flickered to the diamond bracelet on my wrist, the one James had given me for my birthday. The moment her lips parted just slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. I waited for the inevitable condescension, for the remark that would turn this encounter into another reminder that no matter what I had achieved, she would always see herself as above me. But instead, she smiled a slow, measured expression that sent an immediate wave of unease through me and said something I had never expected to hear from her. She told me that she was happy for me. I almost laughed, the words so absurd coming from her mouth that I wondered if I had misheard them. But there was something calculated about the way she said it, something that made my skin crawl. Before I could respond, she leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice to a near whisper, and asked if James had any friends who were still single. I felt my entire body go rigid at the implication, at the casual way she framed the question as if she were asking for a recommendation on where to buy a pair of shoes. It was in that moment, standing there with my sister looking at me as if I were nothing more than a gateway to the kind of life she believed she deserved, that I realized she wasn't envious of me because I had outgrown the role of the forgotten daughter. She was envious because, for the first time in our lives, I had something she couldn't take. I didn't give her an answer. I didn't tell her that James had no interest in playing matchmaker, that his world was not something she could just step into, because she had decided she wanted a taste of it. Instead, I excused myself, walking away before she could press further, before she could sink her claws into something that, for once, had nothing to do with her. But as I left, I could feel her gaze burning into my back, a silent reminder that Charlotte had never been the type to accept being second best, and she wasn't about to start now. When I told James about the encounter later that night, he simply smirked, his fingers tracing idle patterns along the stem of his wine glass, and asked if I was really surprised. I wasn't, but I also wasn't naive enough to believe that Charlotte had asked that question on a whim. If there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that my sister never made a move, unless she was already several steps ahead. I just didn't know what she was planning yet. Charlotte did not bring up James again in the weeks that followed our conversation at the gala, but I knew better than to assume she had lost interest. My sister had never been the type to accept defeat, especially when it came to something she believed should belong to her, and I could feel her presence lurking at the edges of my life, waiting for the right moment to insert herself in a way that would benefit her the most. At first, it was small things. Our mother suddenly taking an interest in my relationship, calling more often than she ever had before, asking about James with a level of enthusiasm that felt forced and rehearsed. She would gush about how wonderful it was that I had found someone successful, as if she had always believed I was capable of attracting a man like him, even though I knew she had once assumed I would be lucky to marry anyone at all. Then my father started calling as well, his tone warm and overly familiar, slipping into conversations about business as if we had always shared a mutual interest in finance and investments. It was all so painfully transparent that I almost felt insulted by how little effort they put into disguising their real motives, as if they truly believed I would not see through the sudden change in their behavior. I played along for a while, giving them nothing but vague answers and empty pleasantries. waiting for the moment they would finally say what they actually wanted. It came one evening during a dinner at an upscale restaurant where my mother had insisted we meet, her expression carefully composed as she reached across the table and took my hand in hers. She told me, in the same sickly sweet voice she had always used when she wanted something, that Charlotte was having trouble finding the right man, that she had been unlucky in love despite all of her wonderful qualities, and that it was such a shame considering how much she had to offer. I already knew what was coming before the words even left her mouth, but I let her continue, watching as she laid out the request as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She asked if James might have any friends, business associates, or wealthy acquaintances who were looking for someone special, someone just like Charlotte, someone who deserved a chance at happiness just as much as I did. I let her finish, let her smile at me as if she expected me to eagerly agree, and then I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap as I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I would not be getting involved in Charlotte's love life. Her expression barely faltered, her practiced poise only slipping for a fraction of a second before she composed herself again. But I could see the flash of irritation in her eyes, the barely concealed frustration at being denied something she had clearly already decided she was entitled to. For a while, I thought that would be the end of it, that she would accept my refusal and move on to another plan. But I underestimated just how determined Charlotte was when it came to getting what she wanted. I started noticing subtle changes in James, things that seemed small at first, but began to stack on top of one another in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He was coming home later than usual, brushing off my questions with vague explanations about last-minute meetings and unexpected business complications, always just distant enough to make me feel as though I was intruding whenever I asked for more details. His phone, once left carelessly on the coffee table or beside our bed, was suddenly always face down, always kept within reach, the screen lighting up with messages he never bothered to explain. I told myself that I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid because of my history with Charlotte, because of the way my family had always operated when it came to manipulating situations to suit their needs. I reminded myself that James was not the type of man to be easily influenced, that he had spent years making calculated decisions in business and would not suddenly allow himself to be played by someone as transparent as my sister. But the doubt had already settled inside me, twisting into something ugly and persistent, gnawing at the edges of my mind every time he left without telling me where he was going, every time I woke up in the middle of the night to find his side of the bed empty. I held on to my denial for as long as I could, convincing myself that I was being unfair, that I was looking for betrayal where none existed until the night everything finally unraveled in the worst way possible. James had been away on another business trip, one that had already been extended twice without any real explanation, and I had spent the evening trying to distract myself from the uneasy feeling that had been growing stronger with each passing day. I was sitting in the living room, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, when a message popped up from an unknown number. The words were sharp and precise, designed to cut straight through any illusions I had left. The message was short, just a single sentence, but it shattered everything I had been holding on to. It said that if I wanted to know the truth, I should check the hotel records for James's most recent stay, that I should see for myself who had been checked in under his reservation. My hands were shaking as I logged into the system, my pulse pounding in my ears as I navigated through the records, my breath catching the moment I saw the name listed beside his. I didn't need any further confirmation, didn't need to see receipts or timestamps or security footage, because I already knew exactly what I would find. Charlotte had been with him. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs as I sat there, staring at the screen, unable to process the full weight of what I had just uncovered. I had spent my entire life watching Charlotte take whatever she wanted, watching her be handed things I had to fight for, watching as our parents bent over backward to ensure that she always came first, but this was something different. This was deliberate. This was calculated. This was something she had done knowing exactly how much it would destroy me. For hours, I sat in silence, replaying every moment over the past few months, every red flag I had ignored, every time I had convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. I thought about the way my mother had pushed for Charlotte to find someone wealthy, the way my father had suddenly taken an interest in my relationship, the way Charlotte had looked at me at the gala, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes filled with something I hadn't been able to name at the time. I thought about every instance where James had seemed distant, every time he had pulled away without explanation, every lie that had slipped so easily from his lips. And then, finally, I thought about the fact that they had both done this, knowing exactly who it would hurt the most. When James returned home the next evening, walking through the front door as if nothing had changed, I was already waiting for him. I didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, didn't give him the chance to spin another carefully crafted lie. I simply told him, in the calmest voice I could manage, that I knew everything. I watched as his expression shifted, as he opened his mouth to speak but hesitated just long enough for me to know that he had been caught completely off guard. And then, before he could even attempt to salvage the situation, he did something I hadn't expected. He exhaled slowly, straightened his posture, and told me, with no emotion whatsoever, that he wanted a divorce. He said it as if it were a business decision, as if we were discussing numbers on a spreadsheet rather than the life we had built together. He told me that he didn't love me anymore, that he wasn't sure he ever truly had, that I had been a phase, a temporary infatuation that had simply run its course. And then, without so much as an apology, he walked past me into our bedroom and began packing his things, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience he was finally done dealing with. I sat there, frozen in place, watching as James moved around our bedroom with the same calm efficiency he applied to business deals, folding his expensive suits into his luggage with the kind of careful precision that suggested he had been planning this moment far longer than I had realized. He didn't try to justify his actions, didn't offer excuses or apologies, didn't bother pretending that this was difficult for him in any way. He had already made up his mind, already decided that I was nothing more than a chapter. He was ready to close, already chosen Charlotte as the woman he wanted to be with now that I had outlived my usefulness in his life. It was that realization, more than anything else, that sent a slow wave of numbness through me, pressing down on my chest until it felt like I could barely breathe. He had never intended to stay. I had been nothing more than a temporary distraction, something to pass the time until he found something newer, shinier, and more entertaining to replace me with. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg him to reconsider because some part of me understood that doing so would only give him the satisfaction of knowing that he still had the power to hurt me. Instead, I simply sat there in silence, watching as he packed his life away without a single glance in my direction, wondering how long it had taken him to become this cold, or if he had always been this way, and I had just been too blind to see it. He finished packing within the hour, barely pausing as he moved from room to room, collecting only what he needed, leaving everything else behind as if none of it had ever truly mattered to him. When he was done, he walked toward the door, pausing for just a moment before turning to look at me, his expression unreadable as he told me that his lawyer would be in touch. And then, just like that, he was gone. The days that followed blurred into something unrecognizable, a series of moments that passed without meaning, each one heavier than the last. I moved through the penthouse like a ghost, barely able to process the fact that everything I had built was unraveling around me, that the life I had fought so hard to create was already slipping through my fingers. The prenuptial agreement I had signed, the one James had insisted, was just a formality, ensured that I walked away with nothing. The apartment wasn't mine. The money wasn't mine. Even the furniture, the pieces we had picked out together, belonged to him. Within a week, I was standing in the middle of an empty living room, surrounded by the last of my belongings, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. In a moment of desperation, I called my parents, holding on to the smallest sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would be willing to offer me a place to stay until I figured out my next move. The silence that followed my request should have told me everything I needed to know, but I still held my breath, waiting for them to respond, waiting for some sign that they still considered me family. My mother was the first to speak, her voice dripping with forced sympathy as she told me that they were in the middle of renovations, that the guest room was completely torn apart, that there was simply no space for me to stay with them. My father jumped in a second later, adding that the living room was also being painted, that the entire house was too small to accommodate another person, that it just wouldn't be practical. Every excuse was weaker than the last, each one more transparent than the one before, each one cutting a little deeper than I had expected. I could hear it in their voices, the barely concealed satisfaction, the way they were barely even trying to pretend that they regretted turning me away. They weren't just refusing to help me, they were enjoying it. They had spent years resenting the fact that I had managed to carve out a place for myself outside of Charlotte's shadow. And now that I had lost everything, they were reveling in the fact that I was finally back where they believed I belonged. I hung up before they could say anything else, my hands shaking as I stared at the phone in my lap, realizing that I had never really had a family at all. With no other options, I found a small apartment on the other side of the city, a tiny, windowless space that barely had enough room for the furniture I had managed to salvage from the penthouse. It was nothing compared to the life I had just lost, but at least it was mine, at least it was something I had built for myself, rather than something that could be taken away at a moment's notice. I threw myself into work, desperate for something to distract me from the hollow ache in my chest, but it didn't take long for me to realize that even that was slipping away from me. Every report I submitted came back with corrections. Every decision I made was questioned. Every task that had once been second nature was suddenly under scrutiny in a way that it never had been before. When I was finally called into Henry's office, I already knew what was coming before. He even opened his mouth, already knew that the conversation would end with me walking out of that building for the last time. He shuffled a few papers on his desk, avoiding my gaze as he told me, in the same polite but detached tone he had always used, that perhaps it would be best if I considered other opportunities. He assured me that they would be happy to provide a reference, that this wasn't about my performance, but rather about a restructuring of the team. But we both knew it was a lie. This wasn't a restructuring. This was James cleaning up loose ends, ensuring that I was erased from the one place where I had built something entirely on my own. For a full month, I barely left my apartment, barely spoke to anyone, barely did anything except stare at the ceiling and wonder how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The silence from my family was deafening. Not a single call, not a single message, not a single acknowledgement that I even existed. The people who had once resented my success were now celebrating my failure, and I could almost hear Charlotte's laughter in the back of my mind, could almost picture the way she must have been smiling to herself, knowing that she had finally won. It was Lily who finally forced me to pull myself out of it, Lily who showed up at my door one morning with coffee and bagels, rolling her eyes as she shoved them into my hands, and told me to get up. She reminded me of who I was, of everything I had survived before, of the fact that I had built myself from nothing once and I could do it again if I was willing to fight for it. I wanted to believe her, wanted to find that part of myself that had always been willing to keep pushing forward no matter what. But it wasn't until one sleepless night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, that I finally knew what I had to do. I had spent years learning every detail of the hotel industry, had worked every position, from housekeeping to front office management, had memorized what made a luxury hotel succeed and what caused it to fail. I knew what guests wanted, knew what made them come back, knew how to build something from the ground up in a way that most people never would. And if James and Charlotte had taken everything from me, if my own family had turned their backs on me, then I would give them no choice but to watch me rise again. The next morning, I sat across from Lily at our favorite coffee shop, took a deep breath, and told her that I was going to open my own hotel. She nearly choked on her drink, eyes wide with disbelief. But the moment she saw the determination on my face, she simply grinned and asked me what I needed to make it happen.